I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. In recent hours, a genuine shockwave has swept through the British public and media landscape after an unconfirmed but consistently corroborated leak from multiple sources suddenly surfaced. Reports claim that Queen Camila personally delivered to King Charles a drafted agreement accompanied by a chilling ultimatum, rejected, and the royal family's most sensitive financial and political secrets would be laid bare to the public. This is no vague gossip. It's a detailed scenario so precise that even seasoned royal watchers have been left stunned. The information spread like wildfire, within hours fueling widespread unease and bewilderment among the public. People are left asking what could be so grave as to transform a marriage that endured decades of scandal into what appears to be a high-stakes power play, bordering on blackmail. But before the storm could fully take shape, a counter-narrative emerged that flipped the script. King Charles is said to have opted for the toughest response prepared to take decisive action to safeguard the monarchy no matter the personal cost. What explosive secrets could Camilla possibly hold that have shaken the House of Windsor to its core? And will Charles's stand protect the throne or trigger the deepest fracture in its modern history? The atmosphere at Buckingham Palace these days no longer carried the usual serene majesty. Instead, it was thick with tension, like a frozen lake on the verge of shattering under the weight of secrets too heavy to contain. King Charles now bore not only the burdens of the St. Edward's crown, but also the crushing toll of a body steadily declining after prolonged cancer treatments that had begun back in 2024. He had always been a sensitive soul, lover of the arts, who yearned for harmony. Yet the role of monarch had forged around him a shell of icy composure. Facing him stood Camilla, the woman who had walked beside him through more than half a century of highs and lows. From the scandal-ridden clandestine years of the 1970s to the grand coronation of 2023. Once his sole confidant, the only one who truly understood his deepest pains, Camilla now entered his study not as a wife, but as a formidable political adversary. Her gaze strangely distant, the rift began seeping into the open, not through official press releases, but through venomous whispers in London's elite clubs. The media, ever attuned to the slightest tremor in the House of Windsor, started picking up on the anomalies. Tabloids that once praised the couple's enduring bond suddenly pivoted, splashing suggestive headlines about a bombshell divorce agreement sitting squarely on the king's desk. In the room, heavy with the scent of sandalwood and aged paper, Camilla slowly placed a black leather-bound file on the mahogany desk. The motion was deliberate and stark, ending with a heavy thud that sliced through the silence between them. It was no love letter or draft speech. It was a divorce settlement accompanied by a staggering figure, £500 million. Charles stared at the file, his slightly trembling hands clasped tightly together. His eyes scanned the cold lines detailing financial demands and privileges, but what truly constricted his heart was not the enormous sum. It was the attached documents tucked behind, sensitive records of secret offshore funds, tangled political connections abroad, and the hidden corners of royal budget operations he had fought to shield for decades. Camilla did not merely want to leave. She wanted an ironclad guarantee by clutching the very soul of the monarchy in her grip. She knew every crevice of the system because she had helped him build and sustain it through the darkest crisis. Charles's mind was a storm of shock and betrayal. He looked at Camilla, searching for a familiar spark of warmth in her eyes, but found only ruthless ambition. She stood there, back straight face, impassive as she laid out the terms. Either a generous payout with ironclad confidentiality, or all these documents would grace the front pages of international newspapers by morning. The marriage, once hailed as a symbol of perseverance against Adversity had devolved into a frigid act of extortion. Charles felt the lifelong trust crumbling beneath him. He remembered their walks together at High Rove, the times she had been his only anchor amid the public backlash following Diana's death in 1997. Yet now that same woman wielded the confidences he had entrusted to her as weapons against him. This was no longer an old couple's quarrel. It was a life or death power negotiation where every word could shake the foundations of the monarchy. When Camilla left the room, without a farewell, the steady click of her heels echoed down the corridor, fading until Charles was left alone in the vast space. He rose slowly and walked to the window, gazing out at the broad palace courtyard where guards continued their silent duty. Pale winter sunlight fell across the portraits of ancestors lining the walls. A bitter taste rose in his throat. Charles knew that yielding would make him a king held to ransom, staining the royal honor forever. But fighting would mean tearing apart what remained of the last love in his life with his own hands. That night, the light in the king's study burned on. He stood, motionless in his mind's eye before the throne, acutely aware that a silent war had truly begun. The cracks behind the throne had grown too wide to mend with mere promises. The crystal chandeliers in the state banquet hall cast a dazzling, almost blinding light that danced across gleaming metals and the sumptuous evening gowns of the elite. Yet, beneath the surface splendor of the ceremony, an artificial atmosphere prevailed, making the air feel more suffocating than ever. This was no ordinary diplomatic reception. It was a performance where every slightest gesture fell under the scrutiny of millions of live television lenses. Charles entered the hall with his customary composed bearing, but deep in his eyes lay an exhaustion he could no longer conceal. He felt the weight of the ceremonial coat pressing against his chest like a vice by centuries old. Protocol Camilla should have walked at his side, her presence a harmonious symbol of the monarchy's unity. Tonight, however, an invisible yet unmistakable distance had been imposed. Camilla trailed several paces behind, only a few feet more than usual, but to those versed in royal etiquette, it was an abyss. Camilla moved with a chilling calm. The attentive expression she once wore, always watching her husband, had vanished. Instead, her gaze fixed straight ahead, cold and remote. Upon reaching the receiving area rather than standing beside Charles to greet the guests together, she deliberately veered aside and positioned herself at the far corner of the room. The move was no accident. It was a public repudiation, a silent declaration that she no longer belonged to us. Charles sensed the ripples of public reaction spreading through the room like a low hum of bees. Whispers rose among the guests as they exchanged glances. He forced his diplomatic smile to remain in place, gripping his wineglass so tightly his knuckles turned white. Each time his eyes inadvertently drifted toward her, he met only a rigid back. Camilla was weaponizing her very presence to create absence. She was there in body, but her mind and loyalty had withdrawn entirely. The climax of the rift came as the orchestra struck up the transition music. Acting on instinct and desperate to salvage the moment, Charles slowly approached his wife. He intended to rest a hand on her elbow, the familiar gesture that would allow them to enter the main dining area together. But the instant the gap between them narrowed to mere centime, Camilla turned sharply. She did not look at him, offered no nod, simply pivoted and walked straight toward a cluster of foreign diplomatic wives. The moment lasted only seconds, yet in the realm of images it carried the force of an explosion. Shutters clicked furiously, capturing the king standing frozen amid the crowd. His outstretched hand, suspended in midair, rejected with brutal clarity. Within minutes, a brief clip of the incident was edited and raced across social media. Headlines proclaiming an irreparable rift began appearing on news websites even before the banquet had ended. Throughout the meal, Charles sat at the center table surrounded by exquisite dishes that tasted to him like wax. He realized Camilla had turned this grand national occasion into a hostage situation. Every deliberate act of separation was an arrow aimed at his credibility, dragging the pressure of their private negotiations into the merciless glare of public judgment. She was proven she could humiliate the throne in the very place where it demanded the greatest reverence. As the evening drew to a close, Charles rose and let his gaze sweep toward Camilla one last time. She stood amid a group smiling flawlessly, yet her eyes remained icy. He understood that the path of retreat had been severed completely. Camilla no longer relied on threats. She had begun to act. Every step she took tonight was a precisely calculated move on the board, cornering him into a choice: kneel before her demands or face an unprecedented media crisis. Charles left the grand hall, his footsteps heavy on the red carpet. He knew that by morning the world would not be discussing diplomatic agreements or royal initiatives. It would speak only of the woman he had once loved most turning her back on him. The battle had escaped the confines of the personal. It had become a public spectacle in which he was the central figure, stripped of the mask of happiness. In the days following the state banquet, the interior of the palace ceased to be a fortress of privacy and transformed into a calculated battlefield of leaks. Charles felt the shift acutely in the demeanor of those around him. From loyal courtiers to household staff, everyone wore an air of unease, their eyes averted whenever he passed. On his desk, the morning newspapers no longer lay neatly arranged. They seemed weighted down by headlines hinting at the shadowy corners of the royal budget or secret ties to energy conglomerates. Camilla had launched her campaign with ruthless cunning. She avoided direct television accusations, instead feeding the press a steady stream of close sources that supplied fragmented but devastating pieces of information. Each revelation was carefully honed to strike at Charles's most vulnerable point: financial transparency. Whispers about opaque investment funds and tax havens and records of political influence used to meddle in sensitive projects began to proliferate. Charles's psyche shifted from the sting of betrayal to a state of extreme tension. He spent hours in the library, fingers absently tracing the edges of classified reports his advisors had just presented. He recognized that every detail leaking into the press matched documents to which only Camilla had access. Each page she exposed to the public severed another thread of the final bond between them. He could not help but wonder, across all those years of intimacy, how much had been genuine affection and how much had been cold, deliberate accumulation for a day like this. When a major newspaper began publishing diagrams tracing alleged irregular royal cash flows, the pressure on the throne mounted by the hour. Public opinion, already unsettled by economic woes, turned its criticism toward the monarchy's perceived extravagance and lack of openness. Standing before the mirror in his dressing room, Charles studied his reflection. A king being driven into a corner by the very woman who had shared his life. He saw himself aging rapidly, the lines etched deeper by sleepless nights and the humiliation of having his most private secrets weaponized for blackmail. The true turning point arrived one late afternoon when a long Irving security advisor entered with a thick file in hand. In that instant, Charles's world collapsed once more. The advisor revealed that Camilla had quietly gathered, copied, and organized these documents over more than a decade. This was no impulsive act born of anger. It was a meticulously prepared exit strategy designed for maximum financial victory. The systematic nature of the betrayal left Charles chilled to the bone. She had stood beside him, listened to his deepest anxieties, witnessed his tears, and all the while recorded everything as potential evidence to be used against him when the moment was right. Camilla's actions no longer resembled those of a wife seeking fairness. They were those of a warrior laying siege to a stronghold. She remained silent, refused calls, and avoided meetings, allowing the sheer weight of the leaked information to do its work. Charles understood that continued silence would be interpreted by the public as an admission of guilt. The honor of the royal family and the stability of the nation now hung in the balance alongside £500 million. The sense of encirclement forced Charles to a decisive resolution. He could no longer sit idle while the monarchy was torn apart by orchestrated rumors. In a rare moment of quiet, he picked up his pen and signed an emergency summons. The Privy Council, the monarch's highest advisory body, would convene immediately. It was an extraordinarily grave step, signaling that the king was prepared for direct confrontation. Charles stood at the window, gazing down at the palace courtyard in the gathering dusk. Long shadows stretched across the ground, heralding a night of storms to come. He knew that once the Privy Council entered the meeting room, there would be no retreat for either him or Camilla. This war would not end with a reconciliatory handshake. It would conclude with the downfall of one side or the other. The Privy Council chamber lay shrouded in a solemn silence so thick it felt suffocating. The dark, oak-paneled walls seemed to close in, pressing against the ministers and advisors seated along the long table. Overhead, dim golden light cast long shadows across their troubled faces, every furrowed brow etched with anxiety. When Charles entered, the rustle of papers ceased at once. He did not immediately take the chair at the head. Instead, he stood motionless for a long moment, his thin hands resting on the polished tabletop, feeling the chill of the wood seep into his skin. In this closed session, Charles began to lay out the matter in a low, measured voice that carried the weight of centuries. He eschewed the polished rhetoric of politicians, instead dissecting the truth with the precision of a man defending the lifeblood of the monarchy. He exposed the threat Camilla posed. This was no mere noisy divorce, but a systematic assault on the legitimacy of the throne. The documents in her possession, if released unchecked, would ignite a fire that could consume public trust, already fragile after years of upheaval. Divisions within the council surfaced plainly in the exchanged glances. On one side were the traditionalists, their faces hardening at the thought of taking severe measures against the queen, fearing the scandal would leave an indelible stain on history. On the other hand were the pragmatists, offering subtle nods of support for the need to excise this tumor before it metastasized into a constitutional crisis. Charles observed them all. He saw the hesitation, the fear, and most painfully the pity in their eyes. That pity cut deepest. It reminded him he was not only a sovereign, but a man who had failed to keep the flame alive in his own home. Inside Charles, a fierce internal struggle raged. In his mind, the image of the old Camilla, the woman whose warm smile had carried him through countless storms, rose like a ghost. He was forced to choose between the Charles of the past, who would sacrifice everything for love, and King Charles, who had sworn to protect the crown at any cost. With each passing second, the duty of a monarch steadily overpowered personal anguish. He understood he could no longer afford weakness. The survival of the monarchy permitted no indulgence in sentimental frailty. The meeting reached its climax when Charles slowly drew out a pre-drafted document. His fingers trembled slightly as they brushed across the stark lines. In order to prepare an official announcement of separation and divorce, the complete revocation of Camilla's title as queen, all royal patronages, and every economic privilege she held. Beyond that, a classified directive authorized the Royal Security Service to take emergency measures to seize and seal all sensitive documents in her possession. It was a total political sentence. When he set pen to paper at the foot of the page, the scratch of the nib against the sheet rang out like tearing cloth in the hushed room. The decision was final. No compromise, no negotiation. Charles lifted his head. The wavering sorrow that had marked earlier chapters was gone, replaced by an icy, unyielding resolve. He had chosen the monarchy over his wife, national stability over personal happiness. The air in the chamber seemed to freeze in the wake of that signature. The advisors exchanged looks, fully aware this was an irreversible step. An era of tolerance had ended, giving way to a silent but merciless purge. Charles rose, his figure solitary and imperious amid the room that embodied supreme power. As he walked toward the door, he did not glance back. Yet his heart understood that from this moment onward, he had truly become a king reigning over the ashes of the love that had once defined his life. In the private quarters of Clarence's house, Camilla sensed the unnatural silence that had settled over the surroundings. No more polite knocks from aides seeking instructions, no more ringing phones from aristocratic friends. She stood at the dressing table, her slender hands gripping the smartphone, her last weapon for connecting with intermediary media channels. When word reached her of the Privy Council summons, she understood that Charles had chosen no compromise. Initial shock quickly gave way to cold fury. She resolved to play her ace, the one she had painstakingly prepared to destroy everything. Camilla's actions now carried an urgency laced with calculation. She accessed the encrypted cloud files, readying the most critical copies of sensitive financial records to send to a senior editor at a major American newspaper, a place where the reach of the British monarchy could not easily follow. Her fingers danced across the screen, the blue glow illuminating a face set in fierce determination. This was the final strike, an attempt to turn their divorce into a global political catastrophe that Charles could not smother with royal authority. Yet Camilla had underestimated the decisiveness of the security apparatus Charles had just activated. The moment she hit send, a red circle appeared on the screen with the message, "Connection failed." She tried again and again, but the entire residence network had been completely severed. A chill ran down her spine as she heard the steady, heavy footsteps approaching along the corridor. These were not the familiar tread of household staff. They belonged to the Royal Protection Detail. The door swung open, not with violence, but with inexorable pressure. Plainclothes security officers entered, bearing a seizure order signed by the king himself. Camilla stood frozen, watching as they methodically collected every electronic device, every tablet, and the hidden hard copy files stashed in secret drawers. She tried to maintain the proud composure of a queen, but her trembling lips betrayed her. The elaborate media network she had so carefully cultivated was now sealed off in absolute silence. Every line of communication to the outside world had been cut, turning her into a prisoner within her own home. Camilla's mind descended into a tumult of panic and bitter resentment. She realized she had lost a race she had been certain she would win. The evidence she had regarded as her life insurance now rested in the hands of Charles's legal team, poised to become ammunition against her in the impending divorce proceedings. Her resistance had been stopped not by force, but by systematic isolation, a precise political surgery designed to neutralize her influence without generating a major public outcry. Across the palace, Charles sat in the monitoring room receiving minute-by-minute updates on the seizure operation. With each device confirmed, neutralized a portion of the burden lifted from his shoulders. Yet, at the same moment, another hollow opened in his heart. He had won the information race, safeguarded the secrets that could topple the monarchy, but the price was the complete erasure of any humanity left in their relationship. He no longer saw Camilla as his wife, but as a controlled threat that had been successfully contained. There were no dramatic confrontations, no further leaks to the outside world. Camilla's entire, final counteroffensive had been crushed beneath the colossal machinery of the throne. As dawn broke, she understood that she had officially become a ghost in royal history. A woman who once held too many secrets, now stripped of any power to wield them. The battle was over, leaving deep psychic wounds that no victory could ever heal. The February morning mist enveloped Buckingham Palace, softening the stern outlines of its ancient stone walls. Inside, an eerie stillness had replaced the turmoil of the preceding days. The power struggle had not ended with a thunderous crash, but with a quiet vanishing. Camilla no longer appeared on royal schedules, her name erased from official bulletins, and the joint portraits of the two gradually gave way to solitary images of the king. Outside, public speculation continued unabated. Tabloids spun endless theories about the Queen's abrupt disappearance. Yet, through the resolute intervention of security and legal machinery, not a single sensitive document had escaped into the open. The monarchy's outward stability was preserved flawlessly, like a mirror smooth lake after it had swallowed a massive stone. Charles had safeguarded the throne, defended the honor of his ancestors, and ensured the survival of the institution against a potentially ruinous act of blackmail. Charles sat alone in the library, slowly turning the pages of the final draft of the divorce announcement, a cold, concise document that stripped away every title and privilege from the woman who had stood beside him for more than half his life. Each line felt like a blade slicing into memory. He recalled the years they had defied the world together to be with one another, only for him now to be the one signing away her public existence. There was no taste of victory in Charles's mind at this moment. Instead, an immense emptiness settled over him, laced with the bitterness of doubt. He wondered whether power was worth so much when it compelled him to transform the person he had loved most into an irreconcilable enemy. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had signed orders for containment, seizure, and isolation, and found them strangely alien. He had become a resolute monarch, an uncompromising guardian of the crown. But the price was the total loss of his ability to trust anyone. As for Camilla, she had become a symbol of ambition that overstepped its bounds in the hushed conversations of the upper crust. Her disappearance served as a chilling warning of the throne's crushing power against anyone who dared threaten it. From a trusted life partner, she had turned into a controversial name, a ghost confined to media oblivion. Her defeat was not merely financial or political. It was the complete collapse of an image she had spent decades constructing. That afternoon, Charles stepped out onto the palace's familiar balcony. Below, the crowd still gathered, hoping for a wave or a glimpse of grandeur. He stood there, back ramrod straight face, an impeccable mask of composure. To the public, he appeared every inch the authoritative sovereign, a living emblem of continuity and endurance. But beneath the ceremonial robes, Charles felt a loneliness he had never known before. He had won the life-or-death contest for power, yet he had lost his own life. As darkness began to fall, Charles turned back inside, passing the resplendent throne in the grand hall. He paused for a moment, gazing at the empty seat beside it, the place where Camilla should have sat. A victory that tasted of ashes. The monarchy had been saved, the throne secured, but the heart of the man who occupied it had truly turned to dust. The broken marriage left not only unhealable psychic scars, it stood as a brutal reminder that at the pinnacle of power, love is a luxury a king can never truly afford to possess. After reading the story, in your opinion, is the character Camilla a reprehensible woman with bottomless ambition, or is she actually just a victim of the poor calculations in the harsh royal whirlwind? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy.